Thank you, Philip, and good afternoon to everybody. Um, I'm wrestling with various windows open on the computer, so anything could happen at this point. But you are the perfect audience, and I know that you'll be able to follow. And if there are any issues, just make sure that you hoot at through the chat, and we will address them. So my title is Elementary Education in the Late Medieval Marches, Exploring the Manuscripts. And this is perhaps the point just to explain that while my professional life, as it were, has been as a bishop, I began as an academic and have remained as a practicing medievalist through the bishoping years, a sort of bishop by day and academic by night. I'm focusing very much on manuscripts from the late Middle Ages, and particularly those containing grammatical texts. So let's set the scene. And the good news is that life in the marches in the Middle Ages, particularly if you were in the marches in the Middle Ages, wasn't all about mayhem and murder. We're going to hear today about how this area was a significant centre of learning as well. My job, though, is to start at ground level with elementary education and leave the others to take us to the stars. And the first big point to make is that more people were literate than you might have thought during that period. And at times there were 4 languages in play in the marches. So English, Latin, Welsh, French. So, people had to be on their toes if they were going to be communicating as they wished to. And they used that literacy for purposes practical and poetic, religious and romantic, scientific and scurrilous. It'd be much more fun to look at the scurrilous, but we're going to look at the rather practical, learning your letters side of things. And learning letters started off for most young people before they went to school, if they were going to go to school, with a thing called a horn book. There's a picture on the screen which shows the infant Christ with a horn book dangling from his wrist, a piece of wood with a piece of parchment on it, on which the letters and the words of the Lord's Prayer were written, and the Virgin is taking him off to perhaps a dame who would take him through those. And I'm sure he was a quick learner. Once you'd learnt your letters, you were in a position to go to school. If you were in Hereford, there was, of course, the choir school, but there was a grammar school open to all comers as well in Hereford from 1245 or thereabouts, ones in other towns too, or if your family was well heeled, you might go off to a private tutor. Abbeys and priories might also have open schools. Sometimes we know it because things didn't work out, so the one at Wigmore Abbey got ticked off by Bishop Mayhew in 1513. It rather failed its Ofsted of the time. Chanceries, chapels in parish churches for praying for the souls of the dead, might well have offered schooling too, because chancery priests were appointed on a pittance and could supplement their income by taking the pennies from pupils. And then there's more. So, for instance, we know that St Nicholas Parish in Hereford at one point had a priest there offering education, because in a lost manuscript from Jesus College, Oxford, we hear of Roger Higgins, who was sometime clerk of St Nicholas Parish in Hereford, and it was a grammar book. So there's lots to find out, lots we know, but an awful lot that we don't know as well. This useful map by Nicholas Orme, who's the great guru of education in the Middle Ages, is from the Tudor period, but it does give you an idea of the spread of formal education and schooling during the Middle Ages, and there would have been many more places than are showing on here. And I'm looking particularly at Herefordshire there. The same is true as we move into Wales, but I don't have a map of that in front of me. I'm not going to look at the evidence of charters, though, or buildings. I'm going to look at some of the surviving manuscripts from these schools, which I think are a marvellous body of evidence, because not only have you got the texts, but you've got the physicality of the manuscript. You're holding the same bit of board and paper or vellum that the people were 500 years ago, and that turn towards looking at physical evidence and artifacts is quite sexy, really, in terms of studying the Middle Ages at the moment. I'm going to look at 4 groups of manuscripts. 3 of them were owned by somebody called Sir John Davis, who was curate of Pencoed off the Hereford Ross Road in the 1490s. Don't be fooled by him being called Sir, he wasn't a knight. If you were a cleric but not a master of arts, you were called Sir as a sort of courtesy title. Think of him as a curate. We'll look at a tiny little notebook surviving in the cathedral archive, not in the library, very strange. Written by a junior clerk there. We'll look at a couple of manuscripts from the Welsh side, from Basingwork and Valley Crucis, very possibly connected with the Cistercian abbeys there. And we'll look a little further afield down to Bristol and Exeter as well. So a few typical features of these books, and Sir John Davies's ones are the ones in the picture sitting on a table in the Bodleian Library where they are now. It's hard to tell scale from that, but they're about what we would call A5, octavo, in old money, because they're made largely from paper sheets, and the paper sheets were folded into eighths, hence octavo, and those folded sheets were then made into quires, and sometimes they would have vellum or parchment outers. Very often each quire had a life as an individual booklet with a text copied into it, and then the booklets were assembled into a book later on. Sometimes the whole book was conceived from the beginning. And in a typical quire or booklet, you'd maybe have a headline keynote item, but then round it, paper was scarce and precious. Whoever owned it would write all sorts of other texts, notes and scribbles. And when I was doing my doctoral research, one of the great joys was just in nerdy detail going through these line by line, milking all these extra little details, because often that's how you found out who wrote the book, when, where and why. Usually they were written by students or clerks, not by professionals. This isn't the world of high-profile books written in London for merchants, or copies of the Canterbury Tales, or big Bibles. These are much more like your own notebook or commonplace book that you've kept over the years. Their handwriting is not very sparkling. If you look at the paleography of it, it's often what we call a mixed hand, which means the sort of handwriting you probably have. You might have been taught to write beautiful copperplate or some modern handwriting when you're at school, but over the years you pick up all sorts of little bits and pieces, and it's a bit of a scribble, and that's what these are. So great fun delving into them. Let's turn the pages of just one of them fairly quickly to just give you an idea of what pages are part of one of them, to give you an idea what it might be like to sit at that desk in the Bodleian Library and look at it. And we'll look at one of the ones from Exeter. We can date it to 1444. We know who wrote it, Walter Pollard, probably starting when he was a pupil there. He came from a merchant family in the area. He kept on using the book for other things over the years. It stayed with him during his life. So here we are. And you can see at the top of the page, he started to write one of the texts which our paleography group was looking at, a little grammar text in English. How many parts of speech be there? It's a text based on one written by John Leyland at Oxford, who was the person who introduced not the teaching of Latin in English. That had come a little earlier at the end of the 14th century, but in the early 15th century, he was the man who actually started to produce little treatises and texts which people would go and learn how to be a grammar teacher at Oxford and then take those away with them out into the provinces, and they spread really quite quickly and widely. But he's got 4 lines into it, and for some reason, I don't know why, he's crossed it out and starts to add some miscellaneous notes and verses in Latin. We need longer than we've got at the moment to translate those now. But then we turn over and see what comes next. And goodness me, there at the top right-hand side, he's started again. How many parts of speech been there? And he's only got 4 lines into it again. And there's lots more middle notes. And on the left-hand side, one of them, I'll try and put a little, whoa, let me try and go back. Oh, if I try and draw a box, the page will move on. But this bit I'm flashing the arrow around is actually a model letter to a bishop. right reverend and well-beloved cousin. So I'm sure Walter Pollard didn't have a cousin who was a right reverend and well-beloved person, but part of schooling was learning how to write letters to people of influence to get them to do what you want, solve your land dispute, give you some money, or whatever. And on the rest of the next few pages, we can see here in die lune Monday, and there are little sentences in Latin. Here's one which mentions Worcester, and this was part of medieval education in school. You were often given a daily sentence in Latin to translate, and as you got better, you might be given a daily sentence in English to translate into Latin. Let's go on again. Yes, there's our text again. How many parts of speech been there? Here's Walter Pollard signing his name, more of those translation sentences. And again. Yes, another go. This is getting very strange, isn't it? More sentences. Let's keep going. And you might have thought, well, he's going to make a fresh start this time. I'm going to leave a nice blank page. I'm really going to sort of have a go, but still only 4 lines. And this is perhaps a point just to underline how scruffy in a way these manuscripts are. In a posher manuscript, the lines you were writing on would have been ruled, or at least a frame around the writing area, not here. Instead, there are little pen trials, people sign their name, having a bit of a scribble at the top probably to get his pen going. And this time he adds another text on divination and augury. I wonder why he needed to know about that, to do with what are called Egyptian days at the New Year. And he signs his name yet again. And now finally, at last, he starts to write the text more neatly, and he can actually make quite a good hand of it. It's pretty clear to read, it's going through, he's actually ruled a little frame, you can see here, with, go back, in dry point, so to keep a nice block of text. Perhaps he's really motoring now. Except that on the next 2 pages, the text continues, but on the bottom half of the pages, for some reason, he's filled it up with all sorts of other notes. It really is a bit of a mixed bag, this thing. Here we've got a copy of a letter from Edward Courtney, which accompanied a writ to seize land in Plymouth for the Crown. And we've also got a model confession. Someone like Walter Pollard would have all sorts of strings to his bow in the Middle Ages, and many of them showed up in the manuscript he was keeping, his commonplace book, if you like. Let's go back to John Davies's manuscripts, though. John Davies's books are rather more focused. He was a parish priest, and he was interested in preaching and pastoral care and how to do a good local priestly job. And the contents of his manuscripts are a bit more closely integrated in that sort of way. The bottom 2 in the pile on the big picture were actually once one manuscript. And one of the joys of looking at them closely is that you can tell they were one manuscript because inside the 2 circles, the end of one manuscript and the beginning of the other, you can see where a little lowly worm ate its way through from one manuscript to the other when they were bound together. So let's find out what was in his. Just a few things here. On the left-hand side, the paragraphical group is looking at this. It says at the top, Dominica Pentecost or Whit Sunday. It's a sermon for the day. Good men and women, as you know well. That they're actually, we found as we read through them, very understandable, very readable, even making points we might want to hear today. And there are model sermons for every Sunday of the year and the feast day. And as we looked at it, we thought, I think he might even have taken that book into the pulpit and just effectively read them out. What a time saver for a parish priest. And this is a series of sermons which have the name Festial by John Merck, a monk of Lillesall in Shropshire. And they were very widely circulated. And I'll say nothing about whether your vicars these days buy little books from SPCK which give them sermons to read out as well. I'll leave that between you and them. Alongside that, as well as the that series of sermons which follow the national pattern, each local area, each local diocese would set up some other feasts of its own with bits of liturgy. And if you moved into an area, and let's imagine that John Davis had done a year or two at Oxford and come to Herefordshire behind Davis, perhaps he came from here, you've got to catch up with what's happening locally. So we look down this list of feasts. Haec sunt festa principalia. Here are the principal feasts held in the see of Hereford. We go down here and there's Ethelbert. So we know we're in Herefordshire if Ethelbert is a major feast. And elsewhere in the manuscript, we get little explanations of the liturgy that we used on the day. There's also another book by John Merck called Instructions for Parish Priests, and part of that is how to instruct your parishioners not to misbehave in the churchyard. And there's a little 16th century note added to there, but it reminds you that dancing, quoiting, playing with quoits, bawling, tennising, handball, football, stoolball, all these things you mustn't do in the churchyard. The very fact that they're being forbidden tells us immediately that people were making the most of their churchyard and enjoying it. And there are some accounts too which are really interesting. And another member of the group and I are hoping to just edit this page and a few other bits and pop it into one of the Mortimer publications, because we've actually got a list of names of local people, and all the names are in Welsh form. We can see all the apps and the verks, and the Jenkins, no doubt where it's coming from. Still not quite sure what's going on here, that one person owes 7 pence and another 9 pence. It's a bit too much for their daily penny or weekly pennies for school, a bit little for tithes. We're going to try and dig into that a bit. And it's worth remembering that quite a number of areas on the border, would you call them England? Would you call them Wales? The border was fluid. And certainly this area of Pencoed, across the Wye, south of Hereford, the Arkenfeld or Erging area, was Welsh-speaking. We know it was Welsh-speaking at the late 14th century, because if you look at the Bishop of Hereford's Visitation of 1397, which was published recently, you see the churchwardens complain. The churchwardens complain that Sir Richard, the parish chaplain there, this is Garway, just down the road from Pencoed, receives a double salary, and what's more, he's unsuitable to perform the cure of souls because he doesn't know Welsh and they don't know English. Well, I don't know how that got on. Maybe they're exaggerating a bit, as churchwardens perhaps do if they're trying to make a point to the bishop. But in that book as well is another grammar text. How many parts of speech been there? We've seen this before. It's exactly the same grammar text that we had before, but actually really rather nicely written out. Bit of rubrication. We can even try, if I enlarge it, reading a bit out. Zoom is crazy for this sort of thing. We'll just try and make sense of it, and then I'm going to say, read it with me, but how many parts of speech been there? 8, which 8, noun, pronoun, verb, adverb, participle, and you can see I put the text at the bottom, conjunction, preposition, and interjection. And one of the joys about this, trying to keep both my screens in sync, is that the scribe has written actually it in West Midlands or Hereford dialect. So producing many as money was clearly the way it was being pronounced here. So I'll read a couple of, I'll just read through this to you, but then I'm going to read it again and I'm going to read the red bits and then listen while you answer me, or something like that. So it would have sounded something like this. How many teams been there? 5. Which 5? The team that is no, the team that is not fully here gone, and the team that is a gone, the team that is more than a gone, and the team that is to come. How know is the team that is no? For he betokeneth the team that is no, as amo I love. How knowest an interjection? For he is a party of spake undeclined, the which short among his will, with an unperfect voice, as wonder, dread, or marvel. So I'll read with you, but you join in with me with the bits which you think are the pupils' answers. You're now the classroom, I'm the master. How many times been there? Thief. Which thief? The team that is no, the team that is not fully a gone, and the team that is a gone, the team that is more than a gone, and the team that is to come. How knowest the team that is no? For he betokeneth that the team that is no, as amo I love. How knowest an interjection? For he is a party of spake undeclined, the which short among his will, with an imperfect voice, as wonder, dread, or marvel. Pupil sighs a sigh of relief. He's got it right. I think it's just wonderful to be able to sort of put ourselves back into the, not the shoes quite, but the voices of the past. And you can even learn a whole Latin sentence and say you've come here today and learnt some Latin, because this is an English sentence which was set for translation in Bristol Grammar School. And in these days, the Lollards were the great worry, the sort of early Reformation thinkers, we might call them. They weren't orthodox, they were persecuted. So we've got to translate the English. They're both money Lollards captured in diverse shares in various shires of this country. So how do we do that in Latin? Multi Lollardim, many Lollards. Sunt are capti, have been captured. In diversis, in various comitatibus, counties, istius provinciae, of this province or country. And there we are. We've learnt some Latin, we've gone to school. And some of these translation pieces have become compositions. And I don't know whether this pupil from Magdalen College School, Oxford, was massively over-egging the pudding or not, but this is what he wrote in his exercise book. The world waxeth worse every day, and all is turned upside down, contrary to the old guise. For all that was to me a pleasure when I was a child, from 3 years old to 10, for now I'm going on to the 12th year, while I was under my father and mother's keeping, be turned now to torments and pain. For then I was wont to lie still abed till it was 4th day, delighting myself in sleep and ease. There durst no man, but he were mad, awake me out of my sleep upon his own head, while me list to sleep. My breakfast was brought to my beddy's side, I wonder whether it was, as oft as me list to call therefore, and so many times I was first fed, or before I was clad. So I had many pleasures more besides these, whereof some be forgotten, some I do remember well, but I've no leisure to rehearse them now. But now the world runneth upon another wheel, runs on another wheel. For now at 5 of the clock, by the moonlight, I must go to my book and let sleep and sloth alone, and if our master hap to awake us, he brings a rod instead of a candle. Now I leave pleasure that I had some time. Here is naught else preferred but monishing, admonishment, and stripes, beatings. Breakfast that was sometimes brought at my bidding is driven out of country, and never shall come again. Oh, the real violin is out there. Let's go to a book written by John Edwards of Chirk. He was the younger son of John Ap Edward, receiver and chief forester of Chirk. We're quite interested in this one because one of Jean's ancestors was the librarian of Chirk Castle in the early Tudor period. So this book was written in the 1480s, and we see these local place names, Pilstonate and Kinnerley, Llangollen. It might have been written at Llangollen Town School, but I've got a soft spot for it having been written at Valley Crwcus Abbey, because the book includes the story of the Holy Cross. It's closely related to another one, Pennyarth manuscript in the National Library, and both the books are larded with Welsh personal names, local dialect, local liturgical items, both so a strong Oxford connection. One of the things we'll hear about more later is that from these sort of border and Welsh areas, students, as the universities developed, did beat a path over to Oxford, and Oxford was the place for learning how to be a grammar teacher. Alongside the university, they actually set up a course, how to be a master of grammar. You got a degree, M. Gram, for doing it. Edward's Compendium includes part of a very well-known Latin verse grammar treatise, the Doctrinale, some of the popular reading texts of the day, Theodolus's Eglog, the Pentateuch Quito, various Latin vocabularies for learning your vocabulary. And Pennant's parallel book is a bit larger and adds in the famous classical grammar, Donatus's Ars Minor, and a couple of earlier medieval grammar books by John Garland, and the Distichs of Cato, and even a moral poem by Robert Grosseteste, who later became Bishop of Lincoln, who was working and teaching in Herefordshire for 20 years in the early 13th century. So we'll turn a few pages of Edward's book and then look at Thomas Pennant's. And this is the flyleaf at the beginning of the book. It was probably blank initially. I don't know why a Talbot was drawn. I don't think the Talbots, who were really Shrewsbury based, really had much connection with Chirk. Maybe it's something else, but he's practiced his alphabets, as you can see, and all sorts of things. He's just sort of gone back and got his pen going there and filled it up. So let's actually get into it. And here you can see that this is a more ambitious production. We've got a really rather nice little decorated capital at the top. And what's really interesting, this is a verse list of verbs and their forms, is that Edwards has gone back and written the corresponding English translations or clues as to what's going on as glosses between the lines. So it shows he's not just copying this text out and that's nice and then moving on. He's really learning it, and he's probably going to use it to teach. And the scribe ends this treatise by saying, here ends a very useful treatise on the list and verbs and their forms. It gets into quite serious grammar because it talks about deponent verbs, which, if you remember from your school days, are those ones which look as if they're passive in form, but are active in meaning. So guaranteed to catch the learner out. Yes, and here's one of our texts in English as well. The English texts are the more elementary ones because this is the birth of the curriculum in elementary education in this country. In earlier days, everything tended to be in the one text and one volume, but now we get graded texts. So this is sort of about level 2, and it begins, in how many manner of we shall do begin to make Latin. So it's how to begin a Latin sentence. It's a treatise on syntactical construction. And again, it's from John Leyland in Oxford. And again, it's really quite neatly written out and certainly could be used. It's not the sort of thing, scribble you go back to and think, what did I mean when I wrote that? It's followed by a copy of that very popular Latin grammatical treatise called the Doctrinale. And you can see here, because it's laid out nicely, which it isn't always, that it's written in verse, and this makes it memorable. And they wouldn't perhaps have been totally memorized as a whole thing. Some people might have taken that on, but it means that little bits of it would stay in the memory when you were trying to work out, how does the third declension go? This would help you remember it. We saw in John Davis's books that anybody who was going to be using this education to be a parish priest in the later Middle Ages, there was a great focus on giving confessions. That was one of the primary tools alongside the sermons for making sure that Christian people understood what it is to live a Christian life. And so here is a penitential manual, which is, what an amazing initial and decoration he's managed to put there. But this would have been, again, very practical and useful for anybody in parish ministry. Here's the cousin of that John Edwards book, written by somebody called Thomas Pennant. It's not quite so neatly written. Again, we've got this text of how many manner shall they begin to make Latin by rightful order of construction. I'll just give you a moment to sort of read through the printed out English version there, typed version, so that you can get an idea of what the text is. While I can do that, I can say that Thomas Pennant was, I think, first a pupil at Basingwork Abbey and later abbot. But again, there's a little bit of a debate as to whether the school really was in the abbey or in an adjacent town. But what's really interesting about Thomas Pennant's book is that he keeps a record of the pupils and the pennies they're paying. And his own name is there. So was that him, that he started this book when he was a pupil and then became a monitor and kept the accounts for the master, and later on became master and later abbot? It's just impossible to work out the chronology there. But just to see all these names, I think each of these was a lad. That they're all chaps in this case. Women did get education too, but less often in the schools. So I wonder what Yefan Griffith was getting up to, and whether he and Thomas Pennant were creating mayhem on the back row as ushers. Well, all this Latin learning. We've got people who maybe spoke Welsh at home, came to school and in English learnt Latin and probably learnt some French along the way as well. Why? Why is this learning going on? Well, it's for a reason. You would learn Latin so that you could be the scribe who wrote that lovely Mortimer document that the society has just purchased. You might become a scribe so that you could write that little notebook in the cathedral archive. We'll look at it in a moment, and learn the skills of a chancery. You might become a grammar teacher. The famous Nicholas of Hereford owned this grammar book called the Catholicon. You might learn theology, become a monk, a cathedral canon, a famous teacher. That's a cathedral glossed psalter. Or you might learn canon law, like Thomas Hutton, rector of Puddleston, who owned this canon law book, and you could make a lot of money being a canon lawyer. Everybody needed a lawyer. This is that little book from the cathedral library. It's tiny. It's about as big as a postcard. It's really just made from one sheet of vellum, 15th century, one little booklet. What's going on here? It's learning how to write a better letter. So that, again, in Oxford, there were teachers who taught you how to flourish your letters and give them fancy ways of writing so that they would impress the recipient. And I think somebody on the cathedral staff had been to Oxford, learnt all of this, was using it, and a young clerk has joined the chancery and is trying to pick up some tips. So you could just say you are moral, but when you start playing around and expanding these, your mind has been seasoned with good morals. It means exactly the same thing. This sounds much more impressive. Or how about the seasoning of morality has perfumed your heart? And you can see marvelously at the bottom how you work up saying that somebody's wise and eloquent, so your mouth shines with the silver of eloquence and your mind gleams with the gold of wisdom. Sadly, the book breaks off after not much has been written. Plague and illness were a real feature of life at this time, and I suspect the person was carried away young. Well, coming to the end of this canter through the elementary side of medieval education, but just remember that part of this being for a purpose was that people were going into education into a tradition which had been going on a long time and was deep and reached high in the Marches and West Midlands. This part of the world was not as provincial. The earlier you go, the less provincial it was. Learned bishops were attracted, like Robert of Bethune or Gilbert Folliot or Robert of Melun and Robert Folliot. We know that all of those were students at the early University of Paris, which was a great centre of learning. The people at the canons at the cathedral, Walter Map was an amazing courtier and writer of that 12th, 13th century period, and was quite scurrilous in some of the things he wrote. Simon de Freyne wrote poetry. We'll hear a bit in a moment. Gerald of Wales hardly needs an introduction. He's one of the characters we'll be hearing about in the sessions coming up, but a major scholar. All of these would at various points have been living at the cathedral here in Herefordshire. And alongside those, serious scientists, and we're going to hear more about that as well in a moment, right across this Hereford, Malvern area, people who were not just pointing at the star and coming up with some fancy astrological ideas. They were doing the maths. They were working out where the stars were in the sky. They were working out the laws of motion which were governing them. It was strong stuff. And amongst them, my favourite, because I'm part of a team editing his scientific works, Robert Grosseteste. Everybody concentrates on his life in the Bishop of Lincoln and say when he was young, he was at Hereford. He was in Hereford for 20 years, and many of his important early scientific writings took place here. So I'll finish with a quote from Simon Dufresne. And he was trying to persuade Gerald of Wales to actually come and spend some time in Hereford successfully. And he wrote this: "The city of Hereford is greatly fitting for you, in which is the proper place of the trivium and the quadrivium," that's the 7 liberal arts. "It has flourished and flourishes, and in this city in a special way, the honour of the 7 arts predominates. May it continue to flourish, and it's great that the work of the Mortimer History Society is playing its part in keeping the arts flourishing into the future." And that's where I'll finish.
Now, there's one question just arrived on chat. Can you see that, David?
I can, and the questioner asks, is the John Leyland I mentioned the same as the topographer? And the answer is no. We don't know whether they were related or not. My John Leyland is usually called John Leyland the Elder, and the topographer John Leyland the Younger. But both of them are very fascinating people.
And then there's a second.
Can we actually?
Yes, David.
And the answer is that the one you can absolutely see is that little one in the Hereford Cathedral Library, because anybody can bowl up and show reasonable credentials and become a reader, and I'm sure the librarians under supervision will be happy to show you that. Many of the others were in the Bodleian Library. There you have to show a reason, I think, for wanting to look at it, but if you can show a reasonable reason that you're exploring the history of something or other, but they are more cautious, particularly the manuscripts. So for many of the others, your best bet is to look for manuscripts which are online, and I know you can't then pick them up and hold them, but if you go, for instance, to Parker Online, which is the manuscripts of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and look for manuscript 233, that's another very similar manuscript with bits of grammar and school stuff in it.
David, are the Bodleian ones available online? Because many of the Bodleian catalogue is now available online, isn't it?
I think only a single side at the moment of these manuscripts. The trouble I always had was that working in the basement level of quality of manuscripts, they're not the ones that the people digitizing things first turn to. So just like when you look at the catalogues of manuscripts, M.R. James, the great cataloguer, will have catalogued the manuscript and written at the end, and then 3 pages of scribbles. And buried in the scribbles are all the things I'm interested in. So I didn't have to edit the text. I actually had to catalogue the manuscript to start to find out what was there.
Right. And then Brian has asked, when did paper become sufficiently cheap for such books to be affordable to ordinary pupils?
A good question. Broadly speaking, once we're into the 15th century, paper gets introduced in the 14th, but obviously it's more expensive at first. But even in the 15th century, it's still a premium product. And I think that it's likely that it's reached the affordability where every local master could probably afford to make their own book and make their own copy, rather than having to try and inherit an old manuscript from somebody else. But probably the pupils didn't have copies of their own. I suspect they were working with slate boards or scraps of paper.
Okay, and then Judith is just saying, could she have the manuscript reference for the iconography of Christ with his hornbook, thinking in terms of the wider context?
I'll just
so
pull,
if
I'm just going to try and enlarge my picture of it here sufficiently. Give me a moment. So it's
well, perhaps David, would it be simplest to put it on chat?
Yeah, okay, it's coming in now.
Right.
So there it is. Yeah.
Right. Okay, and then Brian is asking, will the same style of education apply to St. David's and its huge diocese?
The answer is that we've got, it's a double negative. We haven't got very many surviving examples that education was going on, but we can be reasonably sure it was, because this whole intentionality of education goes back to the third and fourth Lateran councils, which were having an impact across Western Christendom. Something like this will have been happening. We can argue till the cows come home how far English would have been, as it were, imposed or used as the language of instruction as you move more into Welsh Wales. But we don't really have any evidence for the teaching of Latin at an elementary level in Welsh, and even very little in English. We get glosses in French, but there are no elementary treatises in French for learning Latin. And it looks like that English was the go-to language for education like that. Nicholas Orme has published an article fairly recently on education in Wales, and he gives a conspectus of what there was, and I'd refer you really to Nicholas Orme's article for that.
And just whilst you're referencing Nicholas Orme, David, I'll mention that he is one of the speakers at our conference on the 20th of May that I referred to earlier, when Nicholas Orme will be talking about medieval childhood.
Yeah.
Right, a question from Catherine. You mentioned someone from Lilleshall as a contributor.
Yes, so that the monk of Lilleshall's name was John Mirk, M-I-R-K, sometimes spelt M-Y-R-C. He was a monk there and later became abbot, and he wrote these two books, the Festial, a collection of sermons, and Instructions for Parish Priests, which goes through all the duties of a parish priest, written in verse, so it's memorable, and his book was one of the most widely read in the late Middle Ages.
It's interesting to think about how long that style of teaching continued, isn't it? Well, teaching by rote, or learning by rote.
I've studied the. Go on, carry on with it.
Well, I was just to say, I'm old enough to remember that some of my teachers still teaching by rote learning.
The same texts that were being developed by John Leyland, we find in the Renaissance period, where there's a great trumpeting about how education is being spruced up and they're going back to classical models and the rest of it. But when you actually look at the texts which are published for teaching, they're very, very similar. And I've spoken with people, I've edited texts from Eton and Winchester. I've spoken to pupils from the schools there these days, and they're saying, oh, it was like that when I was there. So it persists. I mean, it is a body of information which doesn't change. And of course, there are other ways of teaching. You can immerse yourself in it and do things for little children involving mice, and it's all good fun. But just drilling the kids in the basics of the grammar, as you say, Philip, has changed, but slowly.
Because what's interesting is that it sort of rote learning tests the memory, but doesn't necessarily develop thinking skills.
And it's the translation exercises.
Mm.
And again, Nicholas Orme has edited a vast quantity of these translation exercises, and often people go through and milk them for the little scenes from life, as I did, but just showing that the kids had to get their heads round being able to understand how to construct a sentence and not just, remember one that somebody else had written.
Right, great. Natasha has put a message up saying that she has a John Merck's Festial to Catherine, if she'd like to see it.
Recently edited in the Early English Text Society by Susan Powell, although there's a local history group up in Lincolnshire produced a version as well. No, theirs was of the instructions. Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, thanks very much, David. I think the questions show how much people have enjoyed your talk. So thanks for a brilliant start to the afternoon.